Hey everybody, it's low carb and keto nutrition specialist Amy Berger bringing you the one and only Keto Without the Crazy. Today we are going to flip the script on the word restriction. But before we do that, just a real quick reminder that the Keto Made Simple online course from Keto OG legend Dr. Eric Westman and myself is open for enrollment starting January 8th. This is round 10. So if you haven't done Keto Made Simple yet, or KMS as we call it, and you feel like you're floundering, you want expert help and support and tons of educational guides, and you want to learn how to do keto in the simplest, most non-crazy, most down-to-earth way, then KMS is for you. There's a link in the notes. Okay, on to the topic. What comes to mind when you hear the word restriction? You've probably heard people say, or maybe you've even thought, keto is a very restrictive diet. Or do you feel restricted when you follow keto? Any variation on restriction, restricting, restricted. And if you do feel like keto is very restrictive, is this getting in the way of you sticking to it consistently over the long term and getting the results you want? Because the word restriction tends to have a very negative connotation, right? It feels limiting. It feels almost like a punishment, like it's punitive, right? I'm so restricted, because if we're restricted in some way, then we are not allowed to do something that we probably want to do. But what I want to talk about here that maybe will be helpful for some of you who do feel restricted is that restriction is not always a bad thing. Restriction can actually be a very, very helpful thing, a beneficial thing. So rather than rebelling against this form of restriction, we could embrace it. We could welcome it and use it in a positive way. And I'm going to give you some examples. Those of you who have young children, or if your kids are grown, remember when they were little kids, little toddlers. We don't let little toddlers run across the street by themselves. They better be holding mom or dad's hand or some adult's hand, right? They are restricted from just running all over the place when there's traffic, but it's for their own good. It's for their safety. It is to protect them. Same thing with little kids. They have a bedtime and maybe there's a bath time because, we restrict them from staying up till all hours of the night because it's not good for them. So as a way to protect them in some way, we enforce restrictions. So they might not like it. They might throw a tantrum when it's time to get in bed or in the bath. But we know that restriction that we are placing on them is to their benefit. And so not only can restriction be helpful, like if you are living with obesity, if you have a medical problem driven or exacerbated, made worse by excessive carbohydrate consumption, then restricting carbohydrate in your diet is really helpful for you. It might feel punitive. It might feel limiting, but ultimately it is beneficial to you. That's the whole point of keto, right? Is to help you lose weight or help you reverse some of these conditions by restricting dietary carbohydrate. So that's one way to look at it, is that restriction can be beneficial. Another way to think of it is that we restrict ourselves in so many other areas of our lives that we don't even think about. And we don't associate that form of restriction with punishment and deprivation. Good example of this, I think, is those of you who are happily married or happily partnered with somebody. And I have to say happily, because if you're not happily married or partnered, then it might be a little bit different. But assuming you are happily partnered, you are restricted from performing certain physical activities with anyone else who's not your partner. So that's a restriction that you willingly agreed to. unless you have some sort of open arrangement, which we're not going to go there. That's totally fine. You're a grown adult, but you know what I'm saying? You restrict yourself from engaging in those behaviors with anyone else, but you don't feel deprived. You don't feel like that's a punishment. That's you love, presumably, you love your partner, and you don't want to be with anyone else. So that's a restriction that, yeah, you're restricted, but it doesn't feel like a punishment. And I like this example too. I'm probably giving too many examples, but that's okay. If you have had a couple of alcoholic beverages one evening, unless you want to get arrested, you are restricted, or we are restricted from getting behind the wheel of a car if we're a little bit inebriated. So that's a restriction, but we embrace that. We welcome that. Why? Because it helps keep us safe, and it also helps protect everybody else on the road. That's a restriction that most of us are perfectly willing to accept because it is good for us. We don't put up a tantrum. We don't rebel and say, I should be able to get behind the wheel no matter how. I'm about to fall down and pass out drunk. I'm so restricted. I should be able to drive under any which condition. No. So we accept restrictions in so many areas of our lives that we don't even think about. So, but going back, let's focus a little more on the food and the keto aspect, because if you do associate restriction with punishment and you feel deprived, then it is going to be harder to stick to this. So, I'm not going to blow smoke up you nowhere. I will be honest with you. The truth is, keto is restrictive. It is. It is they actually call it TCR, therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. They sometimes use that in some of the organizations I'm part of because keto has so much baggage attached to it these days because of the keto with the crazy out there, the internet wackadoodleness. So the word keto is so loaded with negative connotations and baggage that we use therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. Then it sounds like a fancy medical term, like, ooh, that's a legitimate dietary intervention. But anyway, it literally has restriction in the name. So yes, keto does require restriction. We are restricting foods that are high in sugar and starch. So keto is restrictive. I'm not going to say, well, no, keto's not restrictive. It is. But that doesn't mean that you have to feel deprived. And it really depends on how you're wired, because you could think, well, yes, I am restricted from eating all these high carbohydrate foods that I might otherwise want to eat, but I get to eat. I am not restricted in eating lobster tails dipped in melted garlic butter, or a fatty ribeye steak, or a New York strip, which is my favorite. Don't let the ribeye crowds come burn me at the steak. So or chicken with the crispy skin, or curry cauliflower soup, or like roasted Brussels sprouts with bacon fat melted on it, like all these delicious things. But both of those things can be true. We can indulge and enjoy all of these wonderful low-carb foods and also be restricted from eating those high-carb foods. But again, restriction is not necessarily a bad thing, particularly if you do have a medical issue driven or made worse by the high-carb foods. But just like the thing of getting behind the wheel when you're intoxicated, or having a rule that your little kid has to hold your hand while they're crossing the street, we put these restrictions in place for our own good, because we know that those foods, or an excessive amount of those foods, is harming us in some way. So even if it is restrictive, and even if it feels punitive, even if it does feel like a punishment to you, and I hope it doesn't, but if it does, you can say that, yes, it feels depriving. Yes, I want to rebel against it. Yes, I kind of resent this, eating this way, but I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to accept that form of restriction in return for losing weight more easily than I ever did before, or in exchange for having the best blood sugar control I've ever had, for being able to stop my insulin injections for type 2 diabetes, being able to, I don't know, have clear skin, being free of heartburn and brain fog and all that stuff. So even if you feel restricted, it's worth it for all the good things, right? So let me see if there is anything else I wanted to say here about restriction. Yeah, and this kind of wades into territory that is almost unrelated to the theme that I wanted to share with you today, which is just flipping that narrative, thinking differently about the word restriction. Because if you can embrace restriction as a good thing and a beneficial thing for you, then it doesn't feel hard anymore. It doesn't feel difficult. It's almost, I hate the phrase self-care, but it's a form of self-care to eat in a way that either keeps you healthy or helps you get healthy if you're dealing with a slew of medical problems, right? It is very protective and beneficial to do this and to be restricted in that way. But the other way to look at it, and I don't like to look at it this way, but it's a valid perspective, and especially if it helps somebody out there watching today, you could say, is keto restrictive? Yes, in some ways, because you do have to restrict carbohydrate, but you know what's even more restrictive? Having to inject insulin every time you sit down to a meal. Having joint pain so bad that your mobility is limited, your quality of life, your enjoyment of activities is limited because you physically, literally can't go participate. Or if you are carrying excess weight to the point that is hindering or hampering your mobility, that's restrictive. Giving up bread, not restrictive. Or it is, but choose which form of restriction you'd rather have. What's really restrictive is being tethered to one of those weekly pill dispensers, and each day, the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I assume they have those in other countries besides the US, but like those daily pill dispensers, it's restrictive if you got one of those for every week of the month and each day's got, 10 or 12 or 17 pills in it. That's restrictive. Watching the clock and being tethered to a medication schedule all day. So is keto restrictive? Yes, but compared to what? Right? There are other things out there that are more restrictive than keto. But that's kind of the separate but related angle I really more wanted to introduce the concept and kind of plant that seed in your mind that yes, it's restrictive because we are restricting carbohydrate, but it doesn't mean that it's a punishment. It doesn't mean you are deprived, and it can actually be beneficial and a good thing and something that we not only accept as something that we have to do, but that we embrace as something that we're glad to do. And it's a joy and a pleasure to do because at least we have this strategy for losing weight and for reversing diabetes and for reversing metabolic syndrome and fatty liver and all those things. At least we have this option. And all this option requires of us is to cut way, way back on carbs. There's one thing. Oh, one last thing before I close out. If you do feel very, very restricted, because, some people in the keto world will tell you the longer you eat this way, the more the cravings go away and your palate changes, that you don't even really want some of those high carb foods anymore. And yes, that happens for lots and lots of people. it doesn't always happen magically for everybody. There are some people who contend with the cravings all along. I mean, it tends to get quieter. It's not as prominent as it was before keto, but it never completely goes away. If they were to try one of those foods, it still tastes really good. They don't get to the point where, ooh, that's so sweet, I can't finish it. No. So if, when I was saying, if you feel restricted and you resent it and you rebel and you feel like it's a punishment, it's because you might resent that you have to eat this way, right? You wish you didn't have to eat this way. You don't. Who's forcing you? Who has you tied to a chair and is either forcing low carb foods down your gullet or is withholding high carb foods from you? Nobody is making you eat this way. If you hate this, find something else. Good luck sticking consistently to something that you hate, that makes you miserable. There's a lot of different ways to lose weight. There's even more than one way to control your blood sugar and reverse diabetes. I happen to think that a lower carb or ketogenic diet is the most effective. It's not the only thing that works. So if you do really resent this and you wish you didn't have to eat this way, you don't. Find something that you enjoy that still works, right? You do want it to work, or don't eat this way, or don't change in some other way that could help, and then just continue to accept the consequences. You don't ever have to change your diet ever, whether it's to keto or anything else. But if you don't, you have to accept that the status quo is going to either stay the same or it's going to get worse. You will either not lose weight, or maybe you'll gain weight over time. Your health problems will not get better, but they will either stagnate or get worse. So you could restrict in some way or accept the consequences of not restricting. But I'm not going to let this go to 20 minutes. We're at 17 and a half. I'm going to close out. I hope that's helpful. I really enjoy giving you these mindset things, even if it's not a concrete thing that you can, put into place, like follow this food list or do this thing. It's a different way of thinking about this all. Because how many times have you heard me say, if you've watched my channel before, if you're new, hello, hit the subscribe button. How many times have you heard me say that the food is the easy part? Knowing what to eat and what to avoid, that's the easy part. The hard part is here. So I feel like we need the mindset tips, and we need different ways of thinking about this more than we need to be told what to eat and what to stay away from. So yeah, remember, Keto Made Simple opens January 8th, 2024, and it closes January 15th, but it's self-paced. So the course actually starts January 15th. Check out the page, the link to in the notes. It will explain all the details. It's only available for purchase and enrollment from January 8th to the 15th. But once you're in and enrolled, then we kick things off, and you have several weeks of support from yours truly and Dr. Westman and a team of admins who know keto inside and out. So just don't snooze on that, because January 15th is the last day to enroll. And if you're watching this before January 8th, go to the page and get on the wait list, because if you get on the wait list, then we will send you a notification as soon as the enrollment is actually open. Okay. I hope to see you in KMS, or if you've already done it, thanks, you already did it, and that's great. I will see you next time. Subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching. And keep the crazy out of your keto.